Quantum Castaways by DustTraveller Chapter 4 Relax. The jungle seethed with life, almost literally boiled. Bugs, reptiles, and every manner of bird and mammal, from tiny beetles all the way up to the fiercer jungle predators, fought and sought, bled and bred. It was almost sensory overload, and it did bizarre things to ancient instincts in the equine brain. Reading about it and actually experiencing it was almost incomparable. Distraction was almost inevitable, and, all too often, dangerous. Twilight had learned, in a not inconsiderable amount of pain and blood over the last several weeks, to keep her ears and eyes on a swivel. Even her often underappreciated sense of smell got a workout. She watched the human run his fingers along the mossy green base of one of the timbers in the palisade wall, inspecting it for cracks and splits, checking its seating and how closely it was wedged against its neighbors. She was often amazed at how sensitive the tactile sense of his fingers were. Hooves just didn't have the sensitivity for this kind of work. "Hey, Sparks, give this one a hard shove down from the top, if you please." She nodded, seeing exactly what was needed, and firmly pressed the top of the timber with terrific telekinetic force. It shifted slightly, coming in line with its fellows. Marshall attempted to wiggle the timber, grunted approval when he couldn't, and sat back on his heels, removing his hat and wiping his forehead with his forearm. Such was their routine. Life was an unending trial of finding where the next meal was coming from, of staying one step ahead of predators, of fighting the mind-numbing monotony of day-to-day survival. At this point, being honest with herself, she realized she wouldn't have lasted a week on this island by herself. Oh, she was smart, and she was no fool, but he'd saved her hide a half-dozen times over just by pointing out trouble spots and telltale signs of danger that he'd had to learn from bitter experience. "You know," she said musingly, "I've been thinking about this island. We really have no way of knowing if we're even in the same universe. I mean, both of us are experiencing differences in our physical model that would seem to suggest that they aren't entirely compatible." These kinds of conversation were common between them, and truthfully, she cherished them. He called them bullshitting, and while she vehemently disagreed with the terminology, she did rather like how they passed the time. Marshall was a born debater, and a love of science fiction and an engineering degree gave him a pretty large basis to argue from. "Just because I've never observed magic doesn't mean it wasn't possible on Earth," he said, not unkindly. "In fact, there is circumstantial evidence which suggests that if it doesn't exist now, it might have at one time. You know, myths and legends and crap." He removed a canteen from his belt, poured a little on his head, took a swig, then tossed it unthinkingly at her without looking. She caught it easily with her magic and did the same, letting out a little shiver of pleasure as the lukewarm water ran through her mane. She "hydrated," as he called it, and mused about how several weeks ago it would have never occurred to her to be worried about the color of her urine. She slipped the canteen's belt clip onto the tough leather, real animal hide, oddly it didn't bother her as much as it used to, strap of the saddle bag she'd put together from some of the canvas he'd had around, and let out a disgusted breath at the muggy heat of the day. Marshall had once jokingly called surviving in the jungle "living in a fat man's armpit," and despite her disgust, she couldn't exactly disagree with him. She didn't even want to imagine what she looked like at this point. She'd never been a terribly vain pony by any standard of the word, but Rarity would probably have fainted dead away if she'd gotten a look at her friend at this point. Imagining this brought a small, wistful smile to her muzzle. She shook it off. "Point taken, but really, we can't make any assumptions about our current situation. I mean, we could literally be anywhere." He scratched his chin thoughtfully, winced, pulled something small from his beard, and pinched it until it cracked. That was another thing. The jungle wasn't happy unless it was all up in your personal space. Insects, parasites, flying and otherwise, even fungus, were a real problem they had to watch out for on a constant basis. Whatever limited body modesty and personal space she'd had regarding the human, and he vice versa, had gone away very quickly indeed. Right around the first time she developed an itchy rash high on her back between her shoulders, and he'd picked away the tick or whatever it had been that she couldn't reach, then given her a good scratch. Oh, Celestia, that was heavenly. Fingers were the best. Well, we can make a couple of assumptions, Sparks. I'm an engineer, not a scientist, mind you, and it is more a philosophical consideration than a scientific one. But have you ever heard of the anthropic principle? She frowned, then brightened. This sounded good. No, go on. He grinned wryly at her enthusiasm and returned to his inspection, thinking over his words carefully. Okay, so the universe could literally have an infinite number of possible configurations of physical laws, right? Like carbon could have been extremely rare, or the relation between strong nuclear forces and weak nuclear forces could have been switched. You follow me? She nodded. Infinite combinations of possible outcomes, but only a very narrow band of those outcomes support our particular form of life. She mused over this, thinking she might know where he was going with this, but wanting to hear him elucidate it rather than jumping to conclusions. He grinned and pointed a finger at her. Exactly. So the band of carbon-based life producing outcomes of universe configuration are pretty damn slim. The chances are astronomical, but the anthropic principle says, wait a minute, we're here to observe it, right? So no matter how vanishingly slim the possibility that conditions could be right for life to exist, it must have happened because we're even here to consider how vanishingly small the possibility is. She nodded, a gleam in her eye. Right. I think I see where you're going with this, but go on. Now, from what you've told me, magic is a vital part of this complete breakfast, right? He gestured at her expansively. You need it to survive. Like, not need it like you need a bath or you need a book, but straight up will wither and die if you don't have it, right? She shuddered at the possibility of a universe in which magic couldn't exist, but nodded seriously. All ponies have an innate connection to magic, and the dependency for unicorns is even stronger than some. He nodded. So you've been with me here for weeks, and you seem fine. Since you're still kicking, anthropic principle says that magic must exist here, and must function about like you'd expect it to, otherwise no more Twilight Sparkle, comprende? She frowned. Basically sound, but I think it would be foolish to rely on just that. It takes an awful lot for granted. Having never observed a situation in which magic does not exist, I can't begin to extrapolate how tolerant it is to conditions which may be outside its characteristics. He nodded. Fair enough. Trust the universe, but verify. I dig it. They regarded the wall in companionable silence for a moment. Then Marshall groaned, popped the vertebrae in his back in a rather grotesque maneuver, then stood. He considered her evenly for a moment, then grinned. So, 3 weeks in jungle hell, still kicking. Not bad, Sparks, me lass. Not bad at all. She grinned back at him. Well, I did have some advantages I could name. Still, I must not be doing too bad. I'm still winning. Marshall scowled. 5-4. A narrow margin at best. Things can change in a heartbeat. His expression eased. With your help, we're actually a bit ahead of the game for once, so I put it to you. What would you say to the rest of the day devoted to some rest and relaxation? She beamed. Oh, I was hoping you'd say something like that, Marshall. I've been wanting to get through that training manual. Battlefield Expedient Medicine. It looks absolutely fascinating. He raised his hands in mock surrender. Whoa, whoa there. Too much excitement, Sparks. You gotta take these things slow. Still, I might actually have a better idea. She cocked an ear at him, curiously. After several weeks of interaction, she found that she no longer had to translate equestrian body language. He picked up that she was trying to urge him to continue. Well, I tend to save what limited supplies I have for special occasions, but he leaned in close, looked suspiciously left and right, then whispered something in her ear. Both ears stood up straight and her eyes widened. She actually took a step back to take in his face. Her gaze shining, she looked at him in wonder. Then her expression flickered between doubt and suspicion. This sounded a little too good to be true. Surely after 5 years. Do you mean it? You'd better not be teasing me, human. After 3 weeks I take this sort of thing very seriously. He solemnly crossed his heart and nodded gravely. Pinky promise. She'd told him how seriously she and her friends took those words. In the intense "a game of trolls, you win or you mad" the two of them had going, it had become something of a safe word. She shuddered slightly, her eyes closing. Then she literally bounced with excitement.
Oh, Marshall, you've made me so happy. I don't know what to say.
Marshall smiled softly and shook his head in amusement. You don't have to say anything, Sparks. I already know. Come on, I'll go get the stuff. Let's go get clean for once. She looked off into the middle distance, her eyes still shining.
Clean. With real soap. Real shampoo. It's like a dream.
This is an absolutely amazing rock formation, Marshall, Twilight said after staring for several long moments. Also, I'm not sure, mind you, but I think geologically impossible. At the very least, unlikely. Shh, Twilight, you're ruining the moment. Sorry, Marshall. The two of them went back to surveying the vista before them. Several stepped rocky shelves with waterfalls spilling off of them collected into a natural basin, which then eventually became the stream that Twilight had washed off in on her first day on the island. The result was a sort of a natural 30-foot swimming pool, about 6 feet deep at the deepest point, crystal clear, and admittedly a little cold. Still, for their purposes, it was pretty much perfect, if a little suspect. Frankly, it could have had a big neon sign over it saying, "Attention Twilight Sparkle! This is not a trap!" and she might have still considered it. Survival situations played merry hell with your priorities. Marshall set down the bag of various toiletry odds and ends and intently surveyed the scene as he removed the rifle from his back. Even now he was alert for any sort of danger, and Twilight scanned the jungle intently along with him. Thankfully, apart from the ever-present background noise of the wild, the whole jungle was eerily silent today. Everybody seemed to be taking a break. He finally nodded to Twilight and relaxed a bit, thus indicating that it was probably safe. She quickly shucked the saddlebags loose and set them close to Marshall's bag. Leaning the carbine carefully against a boulder, he sat down and undid his bootlaces, slipped them off, then grabbed an old green plastic bottle with the word Prell splashed across the front. Then he stood, took a deep breath, and charged the pool, leaping into it with a gigantic splash and a cut-off shout. Twilight waded in more sedately, but chuckled at his enthusiasm. She magicked a small wad of salvaged slivers of soap ranging in colors similar to Rainbow Dash's coat to a sort of light pink along with a ragged washcloth from the bag of toiletries, and immediately set about scrubbing herself with great relish. Marshall broke the surface with a spray of water, stood and removed his shirt and shorts, letting them float in the pool sedately as he scrubbed himself. Fully naked for the first time since the two of them met, she noted that he had sparse hair on belly and thighs, under his arms, and lower. He didn't notice her curious gaze, or didn't care. Then she noticed something interesting. "Hey! You do have a cutie mark!" she exclaimed. "You never said humans had cutie marks." Marshall spun at her sudden call, and gave a look which was a mix of surprise and confusion. "A what now?" he said quizzically.
"A cutie mark! That mark on your flank!"
He raised an eyebrow. "Are you looking at my ass?" She gestured impatiently.
"No, not any more. Let me see."
Marshall gave her a blank look, twisted awkwardly to stare at his right buttock. Then his eyes widened in realization, and he literally doubled over with laughter.
You thought totally forgot."
She scowled.
"What's so funny?"
He struggled to get a hold of his mirth, caught sight of her expression, and cracked up again. She waited patiently for him to calm down with an air of wounded dignity. Finally he was able to draw a breath. "Oh, man, that was a classic. Actually, I've been meaning to ask about that doodle on your ass. Didn't think it was a tattoo since it looks like it's on your coat, and it's held up too well to be a dye job. So that's a cutie mark?" She frowned quizzically, and tried to flank him a bit to get another look at it. He watched her, a mixture of amusement and embarrassment on his face. "Okay, that's a little creepy, Sparks." She frowned, staring at the symbol. "What does USDA approved grade A beef mean?" He chuckled. "It means don't get blackout drunk in Hong Kong when your lesbian co-pilot is your Liberty partner and you owe her $30. She stared at him blankly. He rolled his eyes. "It's just a joke tattoo, Twilight. I got it when I was drunk. Attractive human males are sometimes referred to as beefcakes. My co-pilot was making fun of me. Sassy was kind of a bitch. He raised an eyebrow. I take it these cutie marks have some kind of significance to ponies? She nodded. When a filly or colt gets to a certain age, they eventually discover what their great talent is. When they do, the cutie mark magically appears on their flank to signify this. It's pretty much the defining moment in a pony's life. What's a tattoo? He went back to washing himself, then picked up his shorts and began scrubbing them against a boulder. A tattoo is a permanent mark applied under the skin by repeatedly piercing the area with needles and injecting a small bit of ink. It can be of great significance to the person getting it, or a drunken mistake, but it certainly don't magically appear. She shook her head. So, humans don't get cutie marks. That's kind of sad. He frowned. What if a pony has a talent that they don't want, like, a trash can or a dish rag or something? She blinked. I don't think it's possible for a pony to get a cutie mark for something they don't enjoy or find fulfilling. It doesn't seem to work that way. And honestly, you wouldn't be the best at something you didn't really like doing. He nodded. Fair enough, I guess. You'd be the expert. So, what does your star thingy mean? She grinned. It signifies my talent for magic. I received it when I accepted Princess Celestia's offer of tutelage. He nodded. Neat. Seems like a pretty efficient system you got going there, Sparks. She nodded happily, then frowned. Marshall, what's a lesbian? He pinched the bridge of his nose. Okay, not awkward at all. A lesbian is a woman, a female human, who is attracted to and enjoys sexual intercourse with other women. Twilight nodded in understanding. Ah, I get it. We have those too. He blinked. Really? She nodded matter-of-factly. Marshall, our gender ratio is something like 5 to 1, skewed towards more females. In some towns it's even worse. Same-sex relationships, interspecies relationships, polygamy, it's way more common among equestrians than you've described of humans. She smirked. I didn't want to say anything, because I didn't want to shock you. You're kind of a prude. He raised an eyebrow, then waved a hand dismissively. Bah! I refuse to be needled by your hipster ways. You don't even wear pants. Your argument's invalid. She snorted at this and gestured at him. Says the guy from the species that has to kill something and wear its skin to keep from freezing. I have no idea why your ancestors ever crawled out of the trees. Actually, that's a lie. I do know why. They were terrified things on the ground were staring up at their junk. Oh, really? He took up his shirt and began to twist the water out of it, winding it up tight. She nodded and went back to lazing in the cool water. Snap! Startled at the sudden whip crack and sting against her flank, she jumped completely up out of the water and came down with a splash, breathing hard and staring about herself wildly. What the buck? Marshall giggled to himself. Oh man, that brings back memories. Class of '97, Towel Snapper of the Year. Her eyes narrowed dangerously, and she gritted her teeth together. His eyes widened and he raised his hands. Wait a minute, motherfucker! Splash! Twilight stared in satisfaction at the huge splash in the center of the pool, where she telekinetically picked up the hapless human and flung him shrieking into the depths. Take that, monkey! A few bubbles and a widening ring of wavelets, but no sign of the human. She frowned. The ripples slowly faded away. The bubbles had stopped. Marshall? Are you okay? She said loudly. She frowned. What if there was a rock out there, hidden under the surface, and he'd hit his head? Anxiety began to flare in her chest. It was then that she learned two very important facts about human physiology. They were terrific swimmers, far outclassing even the most athletic equestrian, and they could hold their breaths for considerably longer. A white foam splash erupted directly in front of her, startling her enough that she reared up and began flailing with her forelegs. Marshall grabbed her around the chest, avoiding those hooves, and bodily lifting her up over his head with a roar of triumph. Marshall, you! She shrieked. There can be only one, he roared, and tossed her flailing out into the depths. When she finally sputtered to the surface, mane plastered over her face and spitting water irritably, she found him watching her intently in some ridiculous and awkward-looking fighting stance, making weird wah noises. He pointed at her and spoke in an oddly stilted manner, exaggerating his mouth movements so that his words didn't seem to sync up with his lips.
"You are quite skilled, young one. But now you must die. I alone am best."
She burst out laughing at this display, horse paddling back to the shallow water.
What in Celestia's name is that thing you're doing with your mouth?
That's what she said. She slammed a hoof playfully into the water, splashing him.
Marshall!
He relaxed a bit, grinning, and flopped his head back in a quick jerking motion to get his hair back out of his eyes. When he dragged it back like that and pulled it into a queue somewhat like a mane, his face took on a slightly more equestrian cast. Well, minus the beard, anyway. She idly wondered how attached he was to it. He shook his head and shrugged. A specific genre of movies, yes, films, like with a projector, moving pictures, right. Anyway, these martial arts, that's like specific fighting styles and stuff. These martial arts movies sometimes get made in foreign languages, and companies will buy them, then dub over the original actors in English, usually very cheaply. It makes for some pretty entertaining unintentional comedy. She grinned. I think I'd really like to see one of those one day. He nodded seriously. Yeah, it's a blast. I'd really... Snap! He yelped and spun, rubbing his right buttock. His shirt was being magically winded up for a second snap. He turned back and narrowed his eyes. Oh, it's on like Donkey Kong now, mere friend. Thus began a solid hour of grabassery, horseplay, shenanigans, and various other tomfooleries. It felt good to let go, to be childish, to not worry about the future or how her friends were doing, or if she'd ever make it off this island alive. It was just her and her new friend wrestling and splashing and generally making real fools of themselves and not caring a bit. In darker times, and there would be many in the future, she would look back on moments like these and take heart. She would remember and gain hope. Moments come and go, but friendship really is forever. It lives in the heart and the mind, in moments like these, perfect and wholesome and ever shining. Then the bottom dropped out of her vision and she stumbled, going over into the pool. Marshall stopped running from her and laughed at her, pointing playfully. Watch your step, Sparks! She flailed to her hooves, lurching sideways, then stumbled again, blinking woozily. Marshall, help! His playful attitude was gone in an instant, replaced by concern. He waded back to her and steadied her, looking her over intently. You okay, Sparks? She closed her eyes, focused her thoughts, then nodded slowly. I think so, just really dizzy all of a sudden. He frowned, scratching under his beard, then looked towards the shore. Maybe you're tired. We should probably head back. She nodded, stumbling again, but he steadied her and they made their way to shore. You okay to walk, Twilight? Do you need me to carry you? She shook her head. I don't think so. This is really weird. I just feel slightly disoriented. He looked worried, pulling on his damp shirt and shorts with fast, nervous jerks, then throwing on his boots and doing up the laces quickly. This was a side of Marshall she was learning to live with. He'd said before that she appeared cute to him, and she suspected that he reacted unconsciously to her as though she was much younger than she actually was. When she'd asked about this, he'd explained the concept of neoteny, which she found fascinating from a psychological perspective. She wondered what that said about her species in general. He looked up at her in between tying laces with anxious concern. You think maybe you overdid it, magically speaking? She gave him a look that said, nigga please, and shook her head. No, I've had reaction headaches before. It's like the ambient thermic field is fluctuating, like the world is, for lack of a better term, flexing. I've never felt anything like it. He scowled, then nodded shortly, picked up the bag, her saddlebags, and his rifle, and they set off back home. When they reached the gate, the lightning started. Marshall cursed and dropped their gear quickly in the courtyard, tearing up towards the cave. Twilight watched him with concern. She'd only ever seen him move with such alacrity and focus when their lives were directly in danger. Slamming open the door, he stepped in, grabbed his binocular case, then sprinted around the hill towards the tree and its observation post, staring at him in confusion, then at the blue lights in the sky with some trepidation. She followed. He took the slat ladder as quickly as possible, basically flying up the side of the tree, his face grim and set. A quick teleport and she joined him, staring up at him in confusion.
Marshall, what is it? What has you so spooked?
He focused the binos on the sky and frowned, adjusting the focus. Skylight sparks. There's no mistaking that blue lightning. She frowned.
What is it?
He focused on the distant strikes. She realized that though the blue flashes struck downward several times, there was no corresponding boom of thunder. It was not a wholesome color either. It wasn't a natural blue. It looked artificial. Okay, that's not creepy at all, she muttered under her breath. Then she realized that she didn't feel dizzy anymore. She gazed thoughtfully at the sky. Looks like it's striking out east. Far east. He seemed to relax a bit, chewing his lip. He glanced down at her. Skylights happen from time to time. Seems to be random. He scowled out towards the east. Always means the same thing, Sparks. I saw them the day you appeared, and other than that, it was the only time they didn't bring me a complete pain in the ass. He took a deep breath and watched the distant silent lightning pensively, his face worried. Something is coming. She frowned at his word choice and shivered. It wasn't entirely the wind on her damp fur. That sky looked ominous. Should we go check it out? He shook his head slowly. It's too far. We'd be stuck out at night, and that's a really bad idea when you don't know what you'll find out there. She nodded quietly.
Marshall, I think it's important to note, I think I felt this coming.
He frowned, then nodded. I think so too. That dizzy spell, you got all woozy, what, about 15-20 minutes before the skylights showed up? You think it's something magical? She considered this.
If it isn't, then whatever it is disrupts the ambient magical environment enough that I can feel it. I should point out that I'm a lot more sensitive to things like that than most ponies.
He nodded. You know, maybe this whole thing is something to do with your world. At least this magic that's a part of you. He frowned and looked into the middle distance, considering something. I haven't been more than 5 miles from this camp in, has to be over a year now. Not since... He shook his head. She frowned at that.
Marshall, what aren't you telling me?
He shook his head. I told you this island is crazy. There wasn't any reason to wander far. You can't leave it. Anyway, I don't want to get into too much detail, because I think the situation may have changed, what with your magical abilities, and I don't want to bias your observations with mine. You're the magic expert. I want you to approach it with a clean slate. She frowned.
Experimentally speaking? Okay, I guess. But, Marshall, I'm going to need something or I'm going to explode.
He grinned. I think it's time for a little road trip, Sparks. Time to come at this problem from a different angle. She grimaced.
Didn't you just say night travel is a bad idea?
He chuckled. Since when did I ever let the fact that an idea was insane stop me? Come on, Sparks. Don't you want to be inducted into the ever-deepening mystery that is this fucking island?
She sighed. You're going to get me killed. I just know it.
He slapped her on the shoulder and gestured expansively out towards the sky. Come on, Sparks. A little mangling builds character. You'll never know what you're really made of till something tries to eat it. She shook her head sadly.
And we just had baths, too.
End chapter 4. Oh, man. Finally. You have no idea how many problems I was having getting this chapter out. First I had a power outage right in the middle of it, so I basically had to restart. I lost a good deal of it because it didn't recover. Apparently my roommate had our power bill on automatic billing, and then they changed power companies without telling us, so the automatic billing information didn't follow them, and without any kind of prior warning they just shut our power off. So that was fun. I have learned that I am not very good at dealing with not having power. Especially not in Florida, which is actually where I came up with the idea of living in a jungle being much like living in a fat man's armpit. That's actually something that my sister came up with to describe Florida weather when you're not in the air conditioning.
So pretty much everybody in my family, we're all used to California weather, which while it's still as hot, it's nowhere near as muggy. So we basically just scramble like cockroaches from one place of air conditioning to another. And as a result of this, I'm like a great white elk. Anyway, um, there were a few things in this chapter that I particularly enjoyed while I was writing it. This particular chapter was literally 90% me taking a break from seriousness, and it's also the portion of the story where I advance time very quickly and imply that there are a lot of things going on in the background that the reader isn't aware of, and that's actually kind of a neat writing trick. Um, Before I started writing Quantum Castaways, I had been working on several other stories, and I ran into a similar problem with all of them. And I did quite a bit of research on other human and Equestria stories, or rather, stories which involved humans and ponies interacting with one another. Because, as everyone's quick to point out, Quantum Castaways isn't actually a human in Equestria story because they're not in Equestria. And one of the things that I noticed is that every single one of those stories goes through a period where there's some cultural differences, but it's really just along the lines of, hey, there's this thing you don't know about. Let's talk about it for like 10 minutes. And the thing is the reader's sitting there going, I already know all this stuff. I'm a human. And if they've watched the show, which I don't know why you'd be reading My Little Pony fanfiction if you haven't watched the show, they also know the things on the pony side that the humans would be confused about. And so you get this dialogue going back and forth where it's really just, hey, here's this thing that the reader already knows. Let's talk about it for a little while, and then let's share that with other things that the reader already knows. And it's this long, boring thing that everybody just kind of drones over. And in order to make things work, they usually focus on topics that are like hot topic items, like, do ponies eat meat, or how would they react to a society that has as much violence as humanity seems to, and what have you, which always leads to the inevitable misanthropic insertion, which I absolutely cannot stand. I think that's the worst trope in My Little Pony fan fiction, and it has occurred quite a bit. Fortunately, it's dying down considerably. Um, I do not. I am of the opinion that human beings should not have to apologize for being what they are. There are good humans, there are bad humans, but we're all humans, and I think there are good ponies and there are bad ponies. The only difference between our two species is that whereas we have been living in a society where we have to struggle for every resource that we have, and our leadership changes constantly due to generations and getting older and elections and what have you, or revolutions, or monarchy seating from old age to one to the other. Like, Equestria has this advantage in that it's got this benevolent, thousands of years old ruler that basically just wants the best for her ponies. So there's an awful lot of advantages that ponies have over us that makes them more able to be peaceful. But that doesn't mean they're not capable of war, because as the series has shown, they obviously do occasionally get into fights. Otherwise, they wouldn't have things like spears and armor and dungeons. So I don't believe that pony culture is anywhere near as um, peaceful and sterile as a lot of the fanfiction writers would lead us to believe. I don't believe that they're anywhere near as warlike as humanity, but they don't live in the same world. They don't have the same problems. They have their own problems. Humanity has never had to deal with someone going randomly crazy and deciding and coming down with the bad case of, destroy the world syndrome. So, I mean, and Equestria deals with that on, like, apparently once a month. So, like I said, different problems, different cultures, and it's the differences between the cultures that I found fascinating and why I wanted to write this. There were several other stories that I had started working on before I finally focused on one idea and decided to run with it. There was a little short period of time where I had the idea to do a My Little Pony Ghostbusters crossover, in which in the real Ghostbusters, if you've ever watched that show, this was a big show back in like the late '80s, early '90s, I think. I was a huge fan of it as a kid, and it's one of those few shows that you watch from that time period that retains most of its entertainment value because the writing was just excellent in it for the most part. Some of the later seasons got a little but for the most part, it was a great show. And one of the episodes in like the first or second season was this thing called The Boogeyman Cometh. And it was about how Egon Spangler had been terrorized as a child by the boogeyman. And as a result of this, he had basically resolved. That's why he got into the supernatural, because he didn't want any other kids to suffer the same way he did. And that was one of the first times. Okay, let me back up a little bit. Fan fiction is basically expanding on a universe. And in a certain, very real way, the real Ghostbusters was fan fiction of the Ghostbusters movie. It was an expansion of that universe. And one of the things that I really liked about that episode is that it enhanced Egon's character. It gave more insight into him, and it actually gave him depth. And I was like, wow, what an amazing thing. I didn't put it in quite those terms when I was a kid. I just thought it's cool that Egon was more of a hero than I thought he was. But looking back on it, I realized how much depth that gave his character, and I wanted to explore it. So I came up with the idea that the boogeyman lives in a pocket dimension that he's created, and it's connected to all the closets on Earth. But what if it wasn't just connected to all the closets on Earth? What if it was connected to some closets in other universes? There's no reason it couldn't be, because it is, after all, a pocket dimension. So I came up with this idea wherein the Cutie Mark Crusaders are being terrorized in their beds by some creature that's coming out of their closets every night. And for the most part, magic is more believable in equestrian culture, and so as a result of this, even though most of the adults don't take them seriously, Twilight Sparkle is curious enough and skeptical enough to want to try to perform experiments to see whether or not it's a provable thing, whether or not they're actually being terrorized by something. And to her horror, she finds that they are, that there's something coming through their closet and attacking them. So being one of the elements of harmony, and being very geared towards, protecting things like that, she basically confronts the boogeyman, who's kind of outclassed from an equestrian perspective, and basically retreats back through the closet. The problem is that Twilight Sparkle follows him there and finds herself in a pocket dimension and cut off from Equestria. And she wanders about this pocket dimension for a while, basically completely lost, and eventually, of course, the episode The Boogeyman Cometh occurs. Remember that the physics in this pocket dimension were different than the physics on a real world. So I was kind of playing around with the idea that you didn't need to eat or drink or sleep in it. It was just meant to be the psychic area of terror that the boogeyman fed off of. And he was kind of terrorizing Twilight Sparkle for a while, and then he got bored of it and moved on to other things, leaving her trapped in his dimension, just wandering around looking for the closet door out. And eventually, the Boogeyman Cometh episode occurs. The real Ghostbusters actually go into the pocket dimension, and when they do that, they find this purple unicorn, and they're like, what the heck is this? But Egon Spangler and the rest of them, being the people that they are, they're not just going to leave some innocent trapped in there. So when they do blow up a ghost bomb to close that pocket dimension, they take Twilight Sparkle out of it, but the only way they know is back to the closet they came from. So Twilight Sparkle ends up trapped in the real Ghostbusters universe. And I had eventually had plans for it to turn into her becoming a Ghostbuster, mostly believe it or not, at the request of Peter Venkman, because that is a money-making thing. Like, Peter would have been like, look, you have this little girl toy, and she's you have this little girl unicorn. Little girls love unicorns. We put her in a Ghostbusters uniform. We have her running around helping us trap ghosts. Man, that is money-making gold. Do you know how much we'll make off of merchandising? And I had a bunch of other things planned. It would have been really cool. But eventually, I kind of let the idea slide because I didn't want that to be my first foray into My Little Pony fan fiction, because that's less a My Little Pony fanfic than it is a real Ghostbusters fanfic. And unfortunately, then I decided, well, how about I write something in which Equestria isn't involved at all? It's just Twilight Sparkle and some random human pilot. So, you know, I guess my intentions don't ever end up the way that I want them to. I should also mention that one last thing. I'll just let you guys know this. I know it's been done very briefly by, I believe, Short Skirts and Explosions. But one of the other projects that I've been working on is a My Little Pony Punisher crossover called um, the Punisher Warzone Equestria, and I'm a little excited about it. I have a lot of ideas for it. It's going to be a different tone, a very different tone than Quantum Castaways. But I think I have an interesting story there. It's a little alternate universe, but it involves the Punisher in Equestria. And before that horrifies you completely, oh man, I have some ideas there. But I don't want to spoil too much because that's probably not going to come out until well after I finished Quantum Castaways. Anyway, I've droned on for quite long enough, so I just wanted to share some ideas that I had with you, since some individuals have said that they like these little author commentary things. And of course, you're not obligated in any way to listen to it. You can always shut it off. That's why I always give like a little message where I say end chapter. It's so that if you don't want to listen to my author ramblings, you can just, turn it off at that point. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this chapter, and I hope you stick with me to the next one. And stay safe, and I will see you again. That's all.